evolution really compatible with an atheist worldview? Are creationists just anti-science optimists? Can an ex-believer physicist and a Christian archaeologist agree about questions on the origins of life and how things came to be the way they are? We are about to find out as we talk about all of that and more on today's episode of Theology on Air. Well, welcome back to Theology on Air. I am Sarah Stone. I'm the Outreach Director for Young Adults at MDPC and also one of the leaders for Theology on Tap, the organization out of which Theology on Air, this podcast, is born. And I'm joined today by two guests that shouldn't be too unfamiliar to you guys. Brian Woods. Brian is an ex-Christian turned non-believer. He has an undergraduate degree in physics and is currently pursuing graduate work in data science and physics. Yeesh. He pursues his interest in the demarcation problem in the philosophy of science, philosophic foundations of quantum physics, and theoretical physics. That is a lot of things that I don't understand, but that's great. That means he's smarter than I am, and that's who we want on here. He's also just one of our token friendly atheists that we love to have come on and rep for that team, as it were. And then, of course, Ted Wright, our modern Indiana Jones. Ted is the founder and executive director of epicarchaeology.org. He's conducted archaeological research in Israel and Turkey. He writes and speaks on apologetics as well as the historical and scientific reliability of the Bible. And again, Sarah Stone moderating for today. And if you are listening to this on the radio and you like the fact that it's commercial free, I just want to remind you that KPFT is a listener supported community radio, and the way that it stays that way is by listeners giving a little bit of money to keep it that way. So if you're interested in that, go to kpft.org to learn more about giving and mention us so we get a little shout out. I will tell everybody that the podcast today is a result of a conversation that happened by text during one of our other podcast recordings. We recorded a podcast a few weeks ago with two Christians talking about evolution and the problems that it presents both theologically and scientifically. And they were making the case that not only is it a problem for Christians, but it's a problem for atheists. And of course, Brian, being one of our token friendly atheists, texted me and said, they are not representing my thought on this quite the right way. So I said, why don't we respond to that and record a podcast where we get it right? And so here we find ourselves. Ted is going to sort of rep for team creation, and Brian is going to give us a better understanding of how atheists think through evolution and how they arrive there. So maybe we can just start first, Brian, with you, and you can tell us maybe where you felt misunderstood in the prior podcast on evolution. Where did we go wrong? Where did we fall flat? Walk us through that. And you're muted. Oh, maybe not. Do we have that? There we go.
All right. But the biggest issue I had was not so much, it was the science too, but they were saying basically the philosophical objections to evolution, where if you do accept evolution to be consistent, you will inevitably go down a path of social Darwinism or some sort of darker, genocidal path or something that leads to a kind of apathy towards other humans and other life. But also, I do think they also kind of got the science wrong in some parts. I don't have the transcript in front of me of the conversation, but that's basically my issues with it.
Okay, so social Darwinism, I mean, we're going to be talking about this later in the show, but kind of the idea behind like eugenics or some species being superior, that kind of thing, you would say you don't want to be pigeonholed in that just because you believe that evolution is how we got to where we are.
I think you don't condemn the good science because of the bad science. So.
Fair, that's fair. Yeah. And for those of you that don't know, the full title of Darwin's Origin of Species is something like Origin of Species, how some species are superior to, or something like that. Am I right?
It's on the origin of species, or for the preservation of the favored races of the human race.
Yeah. Mercy. Okay.
That was 1859, the original edition.
Yeah. Okay, so we don't necessarily fall into that camp. None of us do, but let's do this. In the last in lots of conversations where we talk about evolution, we often get stuck just talking about those sort of first, quote, moments, the singularity, the Big Bang, the sort of moment before and moment after, and cosmological arguments. And that stuff is fascinating. But I think, A, we lose some people because not everybody understands that kind of stuff. But B, there's just so much more to the conversation. So I'm hoping that maybe we can move past that and talk a little bit about like origins of life, some of the biology, which of course we're doing with an archaeologist and a physicist. So this should be comedic at worst, informative at best. But let me ask you this.
It sounds like a farce. It sounds like a Far Side skit.
I know, or the beginning
Right.
of a joke. Yeah. So an atheist physicist and an archaeologist walk into a bar. But let me ask you this. So what predictions should be distinct between a naturalistic or a non-naturalistic explanation of biological origins? Let's kind of get our parameters.
Brian, you go ahead.
Sure. So I would say, and I know you've heard me say this before, deja vu, but I'm going to modify it a little bit. What I would say is you're going to see two phenomena. And what you want to do is use rules that we know work to explain and connect those phenomena through an explanation. And that's essentially what you want to do. And so the rules that we know work seem to be naturalistic from what we know. And so when we observe phenomena, the only thing we have to work with are the observed naturalistic rules, is the case I would make. And I know that's a little bit more than what I've said before, but I just wanted to add that in with a little more.
It makes it a little easier to understand than what you've said before if I'm playing the role of the sort of dumb listener.
Gotcha.
But Ted, wouldn't you kind of say you do the same thing? I mean, it's not like you're like, well, we don't know how that works. Guess God did it. You know, like that's not and I'm not saying that's what Brian thinks either, but.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, obviously as a Christian believer who believes that God did create the universe and all of life, I also recognize that God also uses secondary causes, that God, like, in other words, gravity is not, it's gravity, it's a force. And, when Newton discovered the law of gravity, it sort of caused this, huge, people started freaking out saying, well, I thought God would hold everything together. And so it was just a misunderstanding of the application of theology. But we now know, and scientists believe, that God does use secondary causes and even tertiary causes to create and to bring about life, and not just life, but also other forces in the universe as well. So I would agree with Brian, actually, that that we want to do good science. And I'm of the contention that when you actually look at what the science actually says, and because really science really doesn't say anything. Scientists have to interpret data. We're all looking at the same data. The question is, what is the data saying, and what can we rightfully infer about what we actually see with the data? And again, I'd like to perhaps later share some things about some of the data in the past 5 or 6 years in the scientific literature that actually argues very strongly against the Darwinian prediction. Darwin predicted that life would come from, basically there are two basic processes according to the Darwinian model, and it's mutation and natural selection. So basically that's really what is in the is in the magnifying glass. It's can mutation and natural selection account for all the diversity of life, and not just the diversity of life, but also, and it's something that Darwin really didn't talk about. He assumed that it would also, maybe perhaps scientists in the future would discover the origin of life sort of in this primordial soup. And
let me pause you there, because I don't know if both of you have ever had the chance to listen to Jim Tour, Dr. James Tour. He's out of Rice University down here, whip smart. It's just, when I listen to his stuff, I have to listen over and over again to just get it all to make sense in my brain. But he has this kind of like, he's thrown out the gauntlet to other scientists, saying that there's no explanation for the origin of life outside of a creator. And he's some kind of fancy chemist, organic chemist, I think. And he says that scientists can't build the most basic life forms out of nothing. Like, we can't recreate it in a petri dish, as it were. So how could we think it happened randomly just by throwing in deep time? I don't know if you guys want to kind of respond to that. And I know what Ted thinks, but Brian, how would you kind of counter that maybe.
Yeah, I'd like to hear Brian's understanding of abiogenesis.
How terrible would it be if he held up a petri dish and he's like, just now, I did it?
So so the smallest building or the smallest unit of life that a biologist will call something living is a molecule. We are made up of atoms and molecules. And so I think even from just a basic chemistry perspective, there's nothing that is like a special life force or anything. But the Urey Miller experiment, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Ted, and other experiments following have shown that we can build those things not out of nothing. Out of nothing would be crazy. That would be, I would say that would give you points. But out of like a mimicking of an earlier atmosphere. I don't know, again, I'm a physicist.
Yeah.
There's a lot of details and data I'm not very familiar with, but I am somewhat familiar with the basic ideas of evolution. And to me, I don't see anything in principle that would say there's something else either feeding into the system or coming out of the system that would say we need to suggest something other than what's pre-existing around it.
So I have a follow-up question for you, Brian. Would you say that the first life contains information? It's just a simple yes or no question.
Yeah.
It does contain information. Does it contain complex information?
Complex is an interesting word. I would say yes. The first life does.
Is life complex? Would you say?
Yes. I would say life is complex.
Yeah.
My life feels complex.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but there was a scientist who co-authored a book, and I forgot the second author's name, but the title of the book is called Biochemical Predestination, and it was the basic graduate textbook for abiogenesis, which is basically the theory about how did the first life begin in the primordial ocean. Dean Kenyon was one of the co-authors of Biochemical Predestination, and it wasn't Christians, it wasn't creationists, it was just the mounting data that convinced him that the first life, the first amino acids in the first life could not have arisen by natural processes alone. There had to have been some kind of intelligence, some type of intelligent causation to actually bring about the first life. And so
what is that data?
What is the data? Okay.
Yeah, because
I got an example if you're ready for it. So you just let me know.
Sure.
Okay, let's use well evolution. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, let's talk about well evolution.
So whale, like in the ocean? Whale. Okay.
Yes.
Wait, hold on. Before we get to well evolution, but you said there's mounting data that steered him away from abiogenesis. Within this framework, where we have natural processes, we have molecular chemistry, we have biology, we have physics, and we account for all of these processes going on. And when we examine it closer, we can account for the information and the complexity. So what type of data gives us the idea that there should be something creating it?
Okay, so let me back up. You said something about that we know. I want to challenge you on one of your assumptions that basically, I forgot how you worded it, but the information has not been accounted for by natural process. I would challenge that notion that information is only, where does information arise in the natural world? Complex specified information arise in the natural world. For instance, I have a little thumb drive here that's got 8 gigabytes of space in it. And about 4 or 5 years ago, there was a doctoral student at MIT who wanted to measure the DNA storage, the digital capacity of DNA. And he discovered that 1 gram of DNA actually contains 700 terabytes of information. It's the most complex storage system in the known universe. That's just to give you an example of how much information that is, that's 14,050 gigabyte Blu-ray disc in a 1 gram of DNA. And that's just 1 gram of DNA. We're talking about molecular machinery that is incredibly complex. That's not even the first life. So in order to make the jump from non-life to life, you're talking about a lot of steps of information. So because evolution is not about similarity, it's about, it is really a theory about process and about transformation. So I would kick the question back to you. What natural processes point to the data that shows that we went from non-life to life? Where are the steps? Where are the data,
Sure.
What are the steps to support the fact that we went from non-life to life?
Sure. So when we say, let me define a couple of things, or talk about definitions of a couple of things. So for example, information, like if a rock falls into a muddy puddle, right? And then I walk over to this puddle, but the rock's on the side. I can see an imprint of the rock in the puddle. That rock has left information in the puddle that it's been there. So when we say information, a lot of this I only know about this through like quantum information and a little bit of thermodynamics. But when we say information, what we're talking about is limiting the possibilities of what it could have been before. So when we say like molecules have information, we know based on other processes, what processes could have led to that. And there's, again, and in complexity is also well defined. It's an open field, so it's always being advanced upon, but complexity has a certain set of rules. So the complex systems are adaptive. They are they interact with their environment. And so they have these two things, and molecules do that. Atoms do that. The simplest processes, the most basic fundamental processes that we have do that. Even if you get down to like fundamental physics, right? Quantum wave functions, the wave functions interact with each other. So in these things, you have information where you can say a limited number of things happen either at a different level or at a different period of time. Sorry. And then complexity, you have to, with complexity, it just depends on where you want to go with that. Complexity, I think you can talk about how it interacts with its environment. I guess that's what this would be. But in that case, at every step of evolution, there are emergent properties the bigger things get, and there are feedback loops that happen. And this is a part of the information exchange. And in these loops, so for example, you have molecules that build cells, that build tissues and organs, that build people and then populations. And let's say there's a group of population that's exposed to radiation, right? This group of people, their molecules inside their body will be affected. And if it kills off a certain number of people with random mutations, and we call this random mutations, we call like errors in mutation, will produce, their natural selection occurs. And so I don't know, to me that's satisfying enough. I don't know if it's satisfying enough.
Let me jump in here just for a second.
Sure.
I could just let you guys go on forever, but for those people listening that don't have the degrees that you have, it sounded like Brian asked Ted a question, Ted didn't quite answer it, and then the same thing happened in reverse where Brian didn't quite answer Ted's question. So, and that's okay. But because I know you each have things that you want to be able to say, but Brian asked, what data is there to back up this idea that like there had to be some kind of a cause? And then Ted asked, basically, how can something come from nothing? Am I at least getting the questions right here?
Yes. So to answer your question, Brian, directly, I can give you the information from Dean Kenyon. It's the lack of a naturalistic explanation that explains how life went from non-life to life. Just the data that he saw. So if you want that, I can certainly send you the email, an article for that. But the exact article I don't have off the top of my head.
Sure, I'd be down to read it, but I think the Uri Miller experiment and the following experiments.
I'm not sure what Miller-Urey experiment you read, but it's actually failed miserably. It didn't prove anything. If anything, it actually proved that you have an intelligent cause, but in fact, it didn't create life. It didn't create an amino acid.
Hold on, Brian, do you want to push back on that?
So, yeah. So all the Uri Miller experiment showed was it tried to take what the geologists and geophysicists of the time were saying was the early atmosphere and recreate it. And then they provide an energy source, which we think was there at the time. So in his case, he provided shocks, and it had UV radiation from the sun. And so when we do that, we get the amino acids that we need to build larger structures. And recently, in the past, I only know this from looking this up for this discussion, they found when they reanalyzed it with better equipment, they found that it built more amino acids than they thought it had. And this is I don't even know if that's not acceptable as evidence of it being possible. I don't know how we could, because we're really just trying to mimic the early atmosphere. And so I don't know if that's not getting the type of, like if that data is not satisfactory from a scientific perspective, which it seems to me is, I don't know why, why isn't it, I guess, is the
Well, okay, so for one thing, amino acids are the necessary but not sufficient condition for life. Even if you get, let's just say you've got some blocks that the kids play with that are lettered A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all the entire alphabet. You've got all the blocks, but just because you have the blocks doesn't mean you've got a word. So yeah, you created an A. Yay! Well, that's not life. That's not life. I mean, in fact, one of the things that origin scientists research is basically that the early universe may have been bombarded by asteroids that perhaps contain amino acids or some sort of primordial soup. But even with that, all you have is the necessary but not the sufficient conditions for life. But then also one other thing, I have a friend of mine who just finished his PhD in biochemistry at Edinburgh University in Scotland. And he told me he went, not last year, but the year before last, he went to the Royal Society in London. This is the society that Darwin was actually a part of. And one of the chief scientists there, a German biologist by the name of Gerd Müller, essentially said that Darwinism, as an accounting for origins and as an accounting for biological origins, is absolutely bankrupt. It is not. These are not the Christian creationists. These are the Darwinian, these are the modern day inheritors of Darwinism, are basically saying that the theory is not following up to its expectations. So this is not what I'm saying, this is what they're saying. So it's not that the theories are going against the actual Bible, they're going against what the actual predictions show. And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Let me insert myself here again. Let's pause on the origins for a minute, because of course we're all speculating about what happened so far ago that how could we ever? Let's just for a second say we don't know. Let's move forward a little bit. I think one of the biggest problems that everybody has with evolution, even those that are not Christians but they're just trying to wrap their heads around it, is this idea that when we think about evolution from like species to species, a lot of people are pretty dubious. Can we really go from like amoebas to Beyonce by simply like random mutation? I mean, I know it sounds ridiculous, and I know there's billions of years and deep time is helpful to a point, but maybe you guys can help understand. I mean, even Ted, even though maybe you don't believe that, you can help us understand how that argument is made. And Brian, I definitely want to hear from you about that.
Who do you want to start?
I want Brian to start because you just talked.
So I think I'm going to basically repeat myself and say that there's nothing, these things are, the things that are necessary are there, but we have the sufficient processes. We see these processes happen in labs. We can't directly observe millions of years ago, but we can use dating techniques.
Are you saying that in labs there have been one species that turned into another species?
Okay, speciation has not been observed, or not at a macroscopic level where you would call macroscopic. But it has been in various environments. One of the most studied creatures now, because of Darwin, is the Galapagos finches, and speciation has been observed in them.
Okay, question. It's always been my understanding that the beak of the finch changing over time to like reach its bugs inside the stick or whatever is what we call microevolution. It's small changes over time that help the animal or creature adapt, right? A thicker skin or fur or whatever, those kinds of things. I think that's pretty different from the macroevolution that people are talking about, where that same finch, no matter how long you have, is not going to turn into a human. Or do you think maybe it would?
Well, the finch won't. That finch won't turn into a human.
That's the wrong part of the tree. Wrong part of the tree. Okay.
It's dinosaur.
Right, but yeah, but the point is that macroscopic changes come about from various microscopic changes. If you were to accept the microscopic but deny the macroscopic, you have major problems in the field of biology.
Really? Because I think that's probably where most Christian creationists fall.
Right.
Am I wrong?
No, I think you're right on that.
Brian said I was right.
That,
and we're done with today's podcast. Thank you for joining. No, I'm kidding. Ted, am I right about that? That most creationists would say we assent to microevolution. We can see it. Like we can watch it, but macroevolution is a whole other.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you can actually observe it's variation within a species. There's variation within human species that we can adapt to our climate. You can see that in selective breeding with dogs. You know, you have larger dogs that have a lot of fur that are adapted to cold climates, smaller dogs in hotter environments. But to jump from that all the way over to a completely different species is a whole other thing.
Brian, I see your raised eyebrow.
Yeah. So if I could give you an example of observed speciation, would that just change your mind, or would you adjust what you already think? Like,
it would make you raise an eyebrow. What do you got?
I will definitely listen to it. Absolutely. I'd love to hear what you have to say. And then also, and when you share yours, if I have an example of supposed evolution that naturalistic theories can't explain, would you also consider that may be an evidence for intelligence?
I'd have to know what it is. I mean, if maybe we should talk about design theory or something. But from an evolutionary perspective, I don't know. I'd have to say I don't know. But you said that speciation doesn't occur, and speciation does occur with the Galapagos finches. It's been observed modern day.
Let Brian finish. I want to hear this.
I just want to ask him specifically in the phylogenetic phylum, class, genus, order, species. When you say speciation, at what level biological taxonomy are you talking about when you say speciation?
Yes, like very small, where they cannot breed with each other. So like a species is something that can breed and produce offspring that is also fertile.
Got it.
Right. So over time, the species mate with each other and they produce offspring, and after so many generations, that cannot mate with earlier with a family tree from an earlier generation on another island. That's specifically with the Galapagos finches. And there are other examples that I don't have in front of me. I can Google it right now. It's very common now and I will give creationism credit because it pushed people to find these things. But we have plenty of observed examples now.
That's interesting. Ted, do you want to respond
to
that?
Yeah, so let's talk about whale evolution. We basically have one of the proposed, I mean, obviously, if Darwinian evolution is correct, and if it's an accounting of all the different species that we see on Earth, then whales, obviously, that's a mammal. So in order to go from a land-breathing, land-walking creature to a sea creature that can actually give birth to live young in the sea, one of the theories is, let's see, it started out, there's a fossil called Pakicetus, which is the proto-whale. And then, so we start with Pakicetus, and then we go all the way to the actual whale in the water. And according to one scientist, there are about 10 adaptations that are needed for that to happen, and that's just on the surface. You've got the remodeling of the skull, where the nostrils go from the front of the face to the back of the skull. You have the conversion of the front legs to flippers. You have the reconstruction of the skeleton, including a ball joint that allows the tail to actually swim in the water. You have the transition from teeth to baleen so that the creature can actually filter out plankton in the ocean. You've got the reorganization of the kidney tissues to accommodate the intake of salt water. You've got the lungs that are redesigned and enlarged to withstand intense pressures of deep ocean diving. You've got rubber for thermoregulation. You've got the modification of the creature's eyes, ears, skin to work efficiently in an aquatic saltwater environment. And then the final one is a really important one, and that's the male reproductive system. And I'm going to get a little bit, well, it's the testes, basically. And if you know male anatomy, the testicles of a male creature have to stay cool in order to produce fertility, in order for it to be a fertile. And we know that in reproduction in animal life, that's very important. So in evolutionary theory, if the thing can't reproduce, then it's going to be not going to be an adaptive trait that's going to carry over into and some type of evolutionary adaptation. So with the whale, you've got to have the testes go from the outside the body to the inside of the body, which in the whale it's in the back of the whale, inside the whale. But the testes actually have to be of lower temperature than the internal body temperature. So when the whale is swimming, the internal body temperature of the whale, because it is a warm-blooded animal, heats up. But interestingly, in the back fin of the whale, there are these veins, and biologists have discovered this. These veins actually filter into and around the testes inside of the whale, and the blood in the tail is actually cooled. So it's like a modern-day cooling system. And so all of these adaptive traits actually have to happen. They have to be that you have to see this, and there must have been some type of evolutionary pathway. There must have been some type of process.
Question. Who knew we were going to talk about testicles on today's podcast? Stay tuned for next time. No. Are you, Ted, saying that there are evolutionists that believe, and again, I'm just catching up with y'all, that there was some creature that went eventually from being a land animal to being a whale? I thought we always thought stuff crawled out of the ocean. Is it actually supposed to have gone back the other way?
Yes, that's the. In fact, it's the poster child of evolution, but it actually argues in reverse order. What I was going to say
is that true?
I don't know specifically about whales. I know from my days as a creationist that whales are one of the big creation items.
Yeah.
But I think, can I comment on the whale? Okay, sure.
I wasn't quite finished yet because I have one more data that actually makes. I was about to wrap it up and tie it up.
Sure.
So again, to go back to the whale, there was a study done by I believe it was Harvard. I have to find the exact, but basically, it was studying the beneficial mutations of just 2 beneficial mutations genetically. And what they showed is that in order for the time figuring out all the algorithms and the math, in order to have 2 beneficial mutations, you're going to need 100 million years of time to have 2 beneficial mutations. And we're not talking about just 2 with the whale. We're talking about many beneficial mutations. Mm-hmm. Now, according to population genetics basically says that the transition from a land-breathing creature to an ocean-going whale is 9 million years. So when you according to Darwinian, their numbers. So there's not enough time for. There has to be some kind of intelligent causation in there somewhere. You can't just account for a naturalistic accounting for it because the math just doesn't work out.
Brian, so, I know he said a lot, so.
Sure. So let me talk first about Darwinian evolution in general. So Darwin and as far as I know, all evolutionary biologists today will say Darwin was wrong. In biology, you'll talk about what Darwin got right, which is small, and then you'll go on to 10 lectures about what he got wrong and what modern science has shown us. So Darwin was wrong. The idea that it takes 9 million years to have 2 advantageous adaptations occur is wrong. Sorry?
It was 100 million, according to the population genetics study that was done.
Sure. This is wrong. We know this is wrong because we see observed speciation happen by natural selection based on environmental pressures.
You're talking
again,
about the finch thing again there?
Yeah, the finch thing would be an example of that, where the beak size changes and it's observably changed among different families or different gene pools. And so when we say that, one mistake that I think I used to make as a creationist, and I don't want y'all to make because you're talking science, is it's really tempting to say, oh, here's this environment. If a whale was thrown in there, he'd have to have this. And so it's so unlikely that he'd just have all those things. Really what happened is there were probably families, actually we know this from fossil record and the geological record, that there were groups of vast amounts of species and organisms that died off because they could not survive, maybe because their testicles were warm. I don't know, but that is how evolutionary theory works. And what we do is we have all of these little tiny things like what would be needed to make that change. So we say, can we replicate a situation like that where it happens on a molecular level in a lab where we don't like push the proteins together, we see if it will happen if we just simulate an environment. And we do, and that is what happens. For a whale specifically, I don't know its cooling system. I'd be interested to know, but I can't. It's really hard because I feel like you definitely deserve to know the data and how an evolutionary biologist would address it. But I know it's out there because when I was a fan of Kent Hovind, he was a big guy on this. I know you're not a fan of, you're nothing like Kent Hovind, but the whale thing, I would go and look it up. And there are plenty of responses into how these things can happen.
Right.
So Brian, are you saying that the mistake that you used to make that you don't want us to make is assuming certain conditions in our thought process? Is that kind of the problem? Like everything would be just as we see it today, salt water and whatever, but that maybe all of those assumptions also get us into trouble?
I don't want you to ultimately fall into an argument from ignorance. And Ted knows what that is. Okay, y'all both know what that is. So I don't want you to say,
wouldn't that be ironic?
If you did?
If I didn't know.
What do you mean?
Forget it. Ignorance.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay.
Little logic here. Okay.
But I don't want you to say like, we don't know the exact process that happened for this particular species, and so intelligence must have done it. And what I'm saying is all of the processes are there. We just don't know how for various specific species, how they got there, because it takes an incredible amount of work to go through not just its genetics. You'd have to go through molecular biology, genetic cell biology. You'd have to start examining organs and tissue. Yeah, I mean, it's massive.
Okay, let's do this, only because we could go on and on about some of this stuff for forever, but there's several questions I want to get to, and you mentioned something about the fossil record. So maybe each of you can just say a little bit about how you think the fossil record does enter into these discussions. Brian, you just said fossil record shows us all these sort of animals that were sort of tried and failed, but I mean, Ted, you're an archaeologist, so fossils are your thing, right? You find them sexy? Tell us where you think that enters into this conversation.
Well, I mean, I was just about to ask Brian. He was talking about these failed creatures. Where are they? Where exactly are? I mean, show me where they are. And when we know the geological column pretty well, we know the Cambrian rocks. We know the Burgess Shale Formation is in Canada. With the Cambrian rocks, we have every major animal phyla in a geological instant. They're fully formed.
Okay, let's pause there for a second and tell us. You're referring to the Cambrian explosion, right?
Yes.
Tell us really quick what that is, so listeners that, let's just say people don't know, will know what you're talking about.
Okay, so if you take a cross-section of the Earth's crust and you look at the fossils, the earliest fossiliferous layers of the Earth's rocks, you have the Precambrian rocks, which are essentially, there is no life, And then all of a sudden in the Cambrian rocks, you've got every major animal phyla, which are body plan. You've got chordata, which are animals that have a backbone. You have mollusca, you have mollusk and shells. You have every major animal phyla in a geological instant. So, and there's no pre-evolutionary, there's no transitional forms. You just go from non-life to the Cambrian boom. And it's a problem. It's a problematic for those who are committed to this gradualistic common ancestor view, because where are they? And geology has been going on for over 100 years now, and there's still no satisfactory explanation. In fact, it's such a problem that Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard University actually came up with a new theory of evolution called punctuated equilibrium. And it was addressing the problem with the fossil record, essentially saying that the fossils just don't bear out evolutionary theory. It would predict, Darwin was right, then what we'd expect to find is you expect to find simple-celled creatures as they branch out and you've got this tree of life. Well, actually, what's the other way around? Life started out incredibly complex and incredibly diverse, and we have actually now losing species. So we're actually, species are dying out. So the tree of life is actually upside down. Life started out incredibly diverse, incredibly, fully formed. And in fact, I actually have a trilobite right here. As one does, lying around.
Well, okay, so Brian, respond a little bit to the Cambrian explosion idea of all of these, fossils being found in sort of same time in the slice.
Sure, there's a lot of information to respond to.
I know.
But so I just want to first say that I just want to say a general science statement. It doesn't matter. The hard part about a lot of answers in physics and chemistry and biology, when you get into the really fundamental sciences, is that the satisfaction factor just doesn't matter.
I'm sorry, say that again. The what?
Like whether or not an answer satisfies us is irrelevant to whether or not it really happened.
Okay.
I think there are a lot of why questions that are answered better by certain phenomena and others that are not. So when I say this, I think a lot of people will say, you're just trying to get out of this, but I'm not. And I say this because that's what I used to say. But the Precambrian period, first of all, we do have life observed in it, right? We have it along, I can't remember all the fossil evidence, but if you look up Precambrian life, we have observed found Precambrian life. The Cambrian geological moment, just to be clear, has depending on who you ask, and we can be conservative in this case and say it's 10 million years, but it's a pretty vast amount of time. And right now, the most common theory that I hear is that, we have various mass extinction events, and these come through environmental changes. And at that time, we have a large amount of calcium that is in the oceans at these times. And when this large amount of calcium becomes prevalent, it may become easier to create exoskeletons. And I know Ted has heard this before. So I know maybe it doesn't satisfy you, but that is an existing explanation that works with what we know works as processes. And I don't know how it becomes a problem again for the evolutionist.
I have a follow-up question. I want to go back to information, Brian. We were talking about information earlier, and it's an anecdotal thing. I want to show a couple of things here. So I'm an archaeologist, and in archaeology, we started to study primarily, human artifacts, things that people have made. And the artifacts, we know that they're different from the surrounding rocks because they actually contain information. So the first question I want to ask you, Brian, is just a really simple question, which will lead to a next question. Would you say that there is information both in a rock, and just a regular rock, and information in an arrowhead? Do both contain information? Yes?
Yes,
Yes.
I would say different information, but yes.
Yes, and I would too. Would you say that the information contained in the arrowhead is different than the information contained in the rock?
Yes.
Yes, because it's specified. It's complex, right?
Right.
I mean, no. So
Oh?
can I? No. Let me
Okay.
let me
Yeah,
add a
I'd
caveat
like to
here.
hear your thinking on that. Yeah.
So if, let's say I found an arrowhead, right, in a river, I could, and it like is pristine, like it's not like the tip of an arrowhead, it is like a full arrowhead. I've seen these in books, and I've seen them, people show me ones that have been made. So when I compare it to things that have been made, I can say, hey, this is an arrowhead. It is entirely possible, but very unlikely that it eroded like that. But it is not outside of natural processes, whether or not it's designed.
Got it. Okay. All right. That's fair enough.
Yeah.
So basically, here's the next question I have, which is the follow-up question. This is a piece of pottery from the Byzantine period. It's 4th century Byzantine piece of pottery. We know, you can see it contains, it's not super complex, but we know it was made by humans. We can study it and analyze it. So why can't we infer design from things like this? Why can we say this is designed and this is not designed?
Because, I mean, the simplest answer without going into detail is that we've seen things like that made, and we haven't seen things like that made by something other than through a natural process that is lifelike.
But yeah, it doesn't matter if we've seen it or not. Even if you've never seen, I'll give you another example. In 1908, Greek sponge divers off the coast of the Mediterranean found this big clump of metal that they've never seen before. They've never seen anything like it before. And they analyzed it, they x-rayed it, and it contained gears and cogs and things like that. And it turns out this thing is called the Antikythera mechanism, and it actually predicts the lunar phases. And it was 2,000 years old, and they've never seen one like it. And yet they knew that it wasn't naturally caused. They knew it wasn't a piece of coral. They knew it wasn't a piece of rock. They knew that it, even though it didn't work, they knew that it was contrived and it actually contained very, very complex information. So I would say that it's legitimate. We can legitimately do the same thing with DNA and with things like the cell, which is incredibly complex. It actually shows molecular machines, things like the bacterial flagellar motor. When you look at the simple bacterial flagellum, it actually contains a little outboard motor that has a stator. It looks like something that was designed by the Ford Motor Company. So if we can correctly infer design from pottery or from arrowheads, then I think it is perfectly legitimate and not irrational to infer design from biological life, including the first life.
So Brian,
I would say,
oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I would say that it's not irrational. I would say that it's still an argument from ignorance. Mm-hmm. When we see pictures and things of biomechanisms, they're very pretty looking. Really, like when we look, so we have to talk about hallmarks of design, right, which creationists like to talk about, and molecular biology in these cases. So when we look at something moving, a lot of times we think, oh, that's, what's moving it along? It's a life force. And we actually used to think there was a life force, we as a species. But eventually, we discovered organic chemistry can mimic, we can produce life materials from completely non-life materials. And so when we say we want to infer design from complexity, I would argue that the design we're used to, where we have human complexity, is we have mainly parts that do not interact with the environment. In biological complexity, you have adaptation, right, that happens. And you do not see this in any type of design that we as humans make. It's very clumsy and it's inefficient. So if it is a design, what I would say is that we need to bring the definition of the designer in which case you say it's perfect. But these processes are inefficient. They don't make the best use of the material. One hallmark of design, and I think I've said this to another philosopher friend, was its simplicity, actually. It's not complexity. But
I would call it elegance.
Yeah, I already know that. I have a feeling that Ted's answer to what you just said is going to be more theological, right?
Go ahead.
Well, I want to move us on only because, man, we are flying through time and we have like 8 minutes left to talk about Lucy and floods and all kinds of things. But look, just a quick question, Brian, when Ted asked you about that, if you see this thing, would you not infer design? When he asked you about the arrowhead, you said it was probably that. It was probably man-made, but I wouldn't necessarily assume that because it could be made by these other measures. Why, and agreed, why would you not give deference to the thing that seemed more likely and more probable, like the sort of Occam's razor, like the simplest explanation is the best? I mean, what do you have to gain from looking at an arrowhead and going, probably not man-made? That's just the illustration. But what's the gain from that?
I would say it's man-made. The point is
that's the metaphor. It's a microcosm. That is a metaphor to ask a bigger question of you.
Yeah, the point of that was to say that we see those things made, and so we can infer that, and we see other things like that made, and we can infer that. We don't see something handcrafting like a trilobite, you know.
Sure.
We see, but we do see them coming, like species come, and like a sperm becomes a person. We see things form naturalistically. So I would say it seems like you would first say maybe that formed naturalistically for in the case of a life form.
Okay. I want to move us on. Again, y'all can debate this for hours, but for the podcast's sake, we're moving on. When we think about evolution, I think a lot of people picture the graphic where you have like the ape with the arms hanging down, and then it gradually becomes this man with a, I don't know, briefcase or something, right? It's somewhere along the way we have talked about the missing link, Lucy. I would love to hear you guys talk about that and why that's important, why it matters. Whoever wants to go first can go.
Brian, you want to go?
Sure. So the missing link is kind of a myth. There, really everything is an intermediate form, assuming you produce something. But fossils, etc., according to evolution, you're just another link in this tree. It's not really a chain, so we think of it linearly. Lucy is an interesting case specifically. I don't know much about her. I know that she had an ape-sized head on a bipedal body, and we didn't think, but we adjusted the theory accordingly. And so the hard part is in creation science, from my perspective, is when you have these transitional fossils that go up to the geological column, is determining where a human is and where an ape is, and
sure,
or we are technically, or yeah, we can get into biological terms.
You are.
Yeah, but yeah.
Okay, Ted, I've heard that it's basically debunked, that it was actually two different things that someone put together to sort of make it,
Yeah, well, let me just say, a lot of people are not aware that, do you know why it's called Lucy? They wouldn't even know why it's called Lucy?
I did at some point.
The Beatles?
That's right, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. That song was playing, that's right. So so in archaeology, there's a principle, so let me be clear, there is a distinction between archaeology and paleontology. And the study of human fossils is in paleontology, and specifically human paleoanthropology. So I'm not a paleoanthropologist, but I've studied this, and I have a degree in anthropology. Archaeology as paleontology, text is important. It's super, super important. So in archaeology, we just can't take a piece of pottery out. We have to look at it in its three-dimensional context. In the same way, when you find fossils, you have to, how do you know that this bone went with that bone? So Lucy was discovered in this very, very spread out area. And the paleontologists working there, of course, they're under the pressure because they need to find evidence of human evolution. They took the jaw and they took the bones, but there was no indication that the bone, the head, the skull actually fit the body. So it was put together as assuming that it was part of the same creature. But that connection is rather dubious at best. But I would say this, that all of the supposed Australopithecines, all these supposed missing link fossils are actually extinct apes. So we've got a very broad range of human variation. And for instance, you can't use skull morphology alone, skull shape and size, to determine what kind of species it is. So for example, one of the examples I gave my students is that if you were to look at skull shapes for people around the world today, from Africa to Asia to Europe, and there's a variation of different sizes and shapes and bigger jaws, lower jaws, bigger forehead, you know, you can't determine if that is a different species of person. Well, in the same way, we're looking at these skull shapes and sizes to try to determine if these things are actually, do they actually fit the human family? So, but beyond all of that, even using the dates of paleoanthropology, there are anatomically modern Homo sapiens sapien fossils that are contemporary with supposed missing link fossils, like Homo habilis. Homo habilis, it was believed, was part of the lineage of human modern Homo sapiens. But there's actually a skull, according to evolutionary theory, and I can cite the sources for you, that was found that's about 2 million years old, and it's contemporary with a supposed missing link fossil. So if humans are evolving from these previous ape-like ancestors, then why do we have a contemporary Homo sapiens sapiens fossil existing at the same time? It just doesn't really fit the data. So so that's my answer, my quick answer to the question. And hopefully
nothing about this podcast is quick, by the way. Ryan, I'm going to let you come back on this, and then we're going to end the podcast, but we're going to keep going for you too, because I have 2 more questions and I'm going to be greedy. But did you want to say anything about, like, when you go to the museum and you see the skulls that are like, you know, and then they grow in size, you're like, well, that seems legit. Like, what's that about?
Yeah, they're not just taking into account, they're trying to take into account the context as well. And when things turn out to not be the case, we adjust the theory. But the idea of a missing link, if there's a point I get out on this, there's not really a missing link in evolutionary theory.
I mean, we would probably agree, of course. Well, yeah. Let me do this. Let me say goodbye to those that are listening on KPFT, and stick around for just a second longer if you want to hear us talk about things like the Grand Canyon and philosophical problems with all of this. But for those of you on the radio, you can check us out at facebook.com/Theology on Tap Houston. You can go to our YouTube page, Houston Theology on Tap. You can look for this podcast on any platform where you listen to podcasts and listen to more like this, even the one that got this one rolling. But until we see you guys again, we want to encourage you, as always, to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed. And now for bonus material. Okay, so it wouldn't be a complete podcast talking about evolution and geology and all this kind of jazz with our modern Indiana Jones if we didn't talk about the global flood, because Ted has kind of a crush on the whole Noah's Ark thing. So so I do want to talk just a little bit about the whole Grand Canyon. I mean, this is a common debate within evolution and creationism, but when you think of the Grand Canyon, some say it's a little bit of water and a lot of time. Some say it was a lot of water and a little time. I remember watching that movie on Netflix, is Genesis History, and he starts by standing at Mount St. Helens and saying, doesn't this look really similar to the Grand Canyon? Well, this happened in our lifetime. And so I would just love to hear both of you talk about that. How was that created, given your worldview of creation versus evolution?
Who do you want to go first?
Let's let Brian go first, because I know you're going to geek out and I'm going to have to interrupt you.
Yeah, I don't know much, to be honest. I don't know too much about it. Back when I was a Christian, I know that I had been in the 70s, since the 1970s, that the creation story and making the flood fit. That may even be why you're going to Turkey. I know that there have been people that have said they found the boats in Turkey, but
not a boat.
Or the Ark. What I would say is that you have to be careful when there's so much data, which there's a ton of data on these things. You have to go in when someone makes a claim and research it and look at it and see not only why someone thinks it, but why someone else doesn't think it. So that's all I would say, because I don't really know anything about Noah's flood in terms of the geological record
all of
anymore.
Our flood, Brian. No, I'm being
Oliver.
I am going to let Ted geek out about this a little bit, but let me tell you what we're going to be talking about at the end of this. So you can just have it in the back burner. I would love to close this out by hearing both of you talk about kind of where you think the more philosophical problems are with the other's perspective. I was going to go into a whole thing about Darwin and eugenics, but it sounds like, Brian, that you kind of led off with this idea that just because I believe in evolution doesn't mean I'm a, eugenicist. So we don't have to go there, but I do want to be thinking about like the philosophy. If you carry these worldviews forward to their logical conclusion, what does that mean? Or backwards even. So, but
Sure.
Ted, talk to us about floods and canyons and go crazy.
Okay, so let me, and I will try to be as quick as I possibly can. Let me just start. Brian, I share your skepticism. I totally understand it. And let me just say this. I don't know if this is going to be on air. If it is, it's okay. There are many of my Christian brothers that are way out on left field on this, and they have some pretty radical views on it. And many apologists today, many of the mainline apologists don't even believe in a global flood anymore. But it's most of the young earth creationists do. And I'm not sure if I would even consider myself a young earth creationist, but I do hold to a global flood. But I'm not committed to a young earth necessarily. It could be very young. But again, I have leanings toward that. So I'm not dogmatically committed to it. But let me just preface what I'm about to say with this. And that is, Sarah and I were talking about this earlier, there is a bias in geology against catastrophism. So what is catastrophism? Catastrophism is a view of geology and Earth's history that shows that the Earth has undergone incredible catastrophes. And you mentioned one, Brian, earlier about these extinction events. And let me just say that catastrophism is actually back on the table among geologists and planetary scientists, because we know that the Earth is an open system and it's open to meteorite bombardment. It's open to the Earth is a dynamic system, as you know. There's earthquakes and tsunamis and all kinds of these things that happen. So one of the main reasons why Darwin really got some traction was because of a geologist named Charles Lyell. And Lyell was a geologist who was the modern day proponent of something called uniformitarian geology. And basically, uniformitarian geology basically says that the present is the key to the past. So if we want to understand past geological history, we have to understand the present processes that are operating on Earth. And what he did was he sort of undercut this view that the Earth's history has undergone major catastrophes. So anyway, what I want to say about that is that it's not implausible that there may have been some kind of major event in Earth's history that really caused this massive extinction event. Whether or not it was a flood or not, people make their own mind up. But I do believe that the actual layers of the Earth's crust show that there was some kind of major event that happened in Earth's history. And I know my views are not, even among young Earth creationists, but I'm not committed to these dates. But when you look at something called the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary in the geological records called the KT boundary, this is the event that wiped out the dinosaurs. According to traditional geological time, that was 65 million years ago. So whatever event that was, and most geologists now are pointing to some massive meteorite bombardment that hit the Gulf of Mexico. And so what I think that is actually where the flood boundary is, and that these meteorites that hit the Earth cause tsunamis, cause massive torrential downpour. And to bring the Bible into this, the Bible does say that God broke up the fountains of the deep. And many creation geologists will say that the ocean somehow, well, there's actually evidence that the early Earth, the crust of the Earth was actually contained a huge layer of water. So if you got a meteorite hitting the Earth's crust, it would have released all of this incredibly pressurized water to shoot up into the atmosphere to cause torrential downpour. And then in the Grand Canyon, what we see is, and actually this is a sort of a misunderstanding among many young Earth creationists. The Grand Canyon was formed very rapidly, but we believe it was actually a post-flood event. What it seems to be is that there was actually a glacial lake just north in northern Utah, and that glacial lake burst, and all this massive amount of water spread out into northern Arizona and carved the Grand Canyon. So the horizontal layers in the Grand Canyon were laid down before they were vertically cut. And so these horizontal layers indicate that there was some type of massive sedimentation event that I think was probably from the flood. So
let me pause you just for a second there, because I'm willing to guess, Brian, tell me if I'm right or wrong, that everything that Ted said, that doesn't really take away from necessarily an evolutionist standpoint. Is that right? Other than the part about God doing it, but I mean, like an evolutionist could also believe in a major catastrophe like that, right?
Well, I think, catastrophes happen, but I do think it's fair to be skeptical toward them.
Yeah.
Like, for example, the meteorite example leading to the dinosaurs becoming extinct was nobody took it seriously until we started looking for what you would expect to find. And at that layer, there's an element called iridium that we don't see very much on Earth, that we do find in the layers where we see the dinosaurs go extinct. So then it began to be taken seriously.
Yeah.
And can I comment on what you're saying, Ted?
Yeah,
I don't mean to So what I would say is creation science, or creationists, or however you want to, I don't know what label you want to go under, but what I would say is we need to work together, because part of when I see naturalists point towards bad science, they'll use creationists as example, because you get the same data with 30 different theories because they're trying to make it work. And I'm not saying that that's wrong. I think it may be the case. It's not a reason to just dismiss everything.
Does that not happen on the sort of non-Christian side of science as well? A lot of people having different ideas about why this particular set of data says what it does?
Usually what happens is you have a process that works over here, and then you have phenomena, and then you try and explain it using that process with these phenomena. And so the phenomena works, those two things work. And so when you do that, you try to make a prediction that is a bold, powerful, strong, and falsifiable prediction. And if it's wrong, you've been proven wrong. If it's right, you found something new, which is what you hope for.
Let me say, and I agree with what you just said, Brian. I agree with most of everything you just said. So my, I don't know what I would call myself, but a believer in the flood, I wasn't satisfied with some of the answers that young earth creationists were giving about the mechanisms of the flood. I actually listened to a lecture by Peter Ward from the University of Washington State in Washington State, and it was a lecture on the extinction of the dinosaurs. And when he explained the processes, this is a secular geologist who's actually working with NASA to try to find extraterrestrial planets that have life. He's the one who actually said that this event changed the Earth's surface forever. And and I said, that's exactly right. So that's got to be. And when you look at this layer of iridium, there's only two sources for iridium, and it's volcanism and meteorites. And so, and the smoking gun was the crater found in the Gulf of Mexico called the Chicxulub crater. And since then, they've discovered 2 or 3 other candidates. So when you've got several meteorite impacts hitting the Earth, to give you an example of that, like back in 2000, whatever it was, when the tsunami hit Japan, that was a small tsunami that hit a modern city. When you have a major impact like that, it's going to rearrange the entire surface of the Earth, and it's going to completely rearrange the continents. And so that's why I think that is the best evidence for what we would call Noah's flood. And then after that, we know geologically the Earth got really, really cold. We went into a nuclear winter because everything was kind of blacked out. The sun was blacked out. And then the earliest human civilization are in the Ice Age and the Neolithic. Humans had to repopulate the Earth. And if Noah's Ark does exist, then Noah and his family had to repopulate the Earth, and they had to begin again. So that's where the archaeological record begins, is in the Ice Age.
Brian, I'll give you just a second to push back on that, and then I'm going to go to our final question, if you want.
Sure. I would I would ask a question, like, why wouldn't you just say Noah saw, like, it seems simpler to me and to invoke Pascal's wager to just say Noah was describing, or whoever was writing it was describing what was around them,
Sure.
and it was a flood, and they took it as the whole world, and it seems simpler, right? And it seems like to prove that the flood has happened when nobody else has been able to seems astronomically unlikely, just from the few geophysicists, geologists, the amount of work that would go into showing that it actually happened just seems almost impossible.
Well, I just disagree with you there. I think it's
Okay.
I think it's actually it's so big that we're missing it. It's in fact all the fossils, all the dinosaur fossils, why are they all found in sedimentary rock? Every single solitary one, they're all found in massive flood deposits. So either there's a bunch of little floods happening around the world, or there was one big giant flood, and they're all right in the layers of the right below the KT boundary. So to me, it actually fits the data very well.
I would say, I would wonder, this is just how my mind thinks. I would wonder, is it possible that those situations where we do find the fossils, it's just that environment was conducive to fossilization? And I know that's a big deal in paleontology, but I don't know anything about that kind of stuff.
You know, it's so funny when I listen to you guys talk and I try to be neutral. And of course, I'm not neutral, right? I'm a creationist. But when I try to put that hat on, I hear each of you, I can hear that Brian hears Ted saying things like, you're trying too hard to make it fit this narrative. But then, Brian, when I hear you talk, I hear you doing the same thing. Like, it sounds like you're trying so hard to fit the narrative that you're coming to the table with. And I mean, that's natural. Like, it could be this. It's like, well, that doesn't seem like the simplest explanation. And then you're saying the same thing. It's just interesting.
Well,
I have my theological, Brian, I'll admit, I have my theological commitments. So I'm not going to shy away from those. I mean, I am a Christian, and I do believe the scripture. So that does color my view of the data. I'm not going to confess and say that it does. In the narrative, when I look at the flood in Genesis 6-10, there's nothing in the text that tells me that it's in a kind of metaphorical event. But then also, when I look at the ancient Near East, where is it? If there was a local event, then where was it? I don't know where it is in the archaeological record.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to pause this there because we could be here. Well, Brian, if you have something quick, go for it.
No, go for it. You go for it.
Okay.
I'm good.
Oh, you guys can take this offline, get a beer sometime, and argue about, I don't know, the fossils that you find in different layers of the Grand Canyon or something. But I don't want to lose the audience that's stuck with us for the second part of this, but let's do this. I know we started off by saying there were some philosophical problems, Brian, that you had with the earlier evolution conversation. So I thought maybe we would end by asking each of you, and I'm going to ask Ted to go first so that, Brian, you can kind of have the last word since you are the 1 out of 4 repping for the other team, as it were. What philosophical problems do you have with the sort of other side as they engage in these kinds of questions, looking at creation, looking at evolution, scientific inquiry? Where do you think the philosophical failure is in that?
Oh, well, that's a great question. Philosophical failure. I don't necessarily think it's a philosophical failure. I think it's, I think that many people who are committed naturalists think that it is somehow irrational, and I'm not sure, I don't think that Brian thinks that, but that we are sort of jettisoning reason, you know, when we look at this data. And I think that, one thing does come to, one of the things that really sort of gets at me among naturalist thinkers on this issue is that they automatically exclude, they say that it's got to be a naturalistic explanation. Why are you saying it's a theistic explanation? So they a priori rule out any kind of intelligent causation before even looking at the evidence. So I would say that keep an open mind. You know, you want us to have goes both ways.
Okay, I froze for a second there, so I don't know how that'll be in the recording, but I think he was saying, you want us to have an open mind, you should have an open mind too, to all possibilities, something like that. Sound good?
Yeah. Right.
Brian, did you want to?
Yeah, I would say that, for one, you don't want to base you know, you don't want to condemn good science for bad science. So when someone talks about eugenics, you don't want to, you know, destroy or take condemn evolution because someone misconstrues it. What I would say about the other side of this discussion, not necessarily Ted, I think both sides are rational. I think there is reason going on. I think the problem is in, I guess you could say, Pascal's wager, or in multiplying entities unnecessarily and things like that. But it's taking a narrative and filling in holes where you can figure out to make that narrative work. I don't think I'm doing that. So when, for example, when you give me a piece of evidence and you say it's obviously created by something intelligent, the processes I know that create that are natural. So when you say it's intelligent, I am not just completely condemning it or saying it's off the table. It's just, once we start talking about it, it seems like I can pick it apart with what I know about the naturalistic world. But I don't think it's off the table, and I don't think that's a good reason. I think there is theology out there that is made to account for what I just said. But I do think it's purely philosophical and purely based on reason. But I don't think it's irrational in the sense that you're just like, you know, I don't think anybody on these calls is typically doing that. So
yeah. Well, good. There's some mutual respect that we're all coming in this using our brains, which is nice. That's what we want. And one of these days we'll convince you. But until that time comes, if
were you winking at Ted? No, I'm just kidding.
That's funny. Yeah, we'll convince Ted. No.
Yeah.
Until that day comes, if people want to reach out to either of you about something that you said today, or pick your brain further about like your stance on these things, if you're open to that, share your like, Ted, where can people find you?
They can email me at ted@epicarchaeology.org, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you have. They can also check me out on my website, epicarchaeology.org.
And if you find yourself unable to spell that, just throw in another vowel. There's so many vowels in that word. Every time I type it, I'm like, oh, with the vowels. Okay. Brian, what about you?
If you're so compelled to contact me, you can contact me at thisisbrianwoods@gmail.com. Brian with an I. So
okay. And
that's it.
No, yeah. And both of you have interesting like podcasty things in the works. And so we can talk about that another time. But thank you guys for being on and for having a gracious and winsome conversation about things where we really disagree. It's fascinating. I mean, I feel like I learned things today that I didn't know before. So I appreciate that.
Cool. Thank you for having me on.
All right. Well, bye.
Bye.